yours.
I thank the gentleman from California for yielding and for your leadership. I was thinking here as I was sitting that 18 years ago, almost this month, I testified before the House Judiciary Committee before the passage of the Violence Against Women Act on behalf of domestic violence advocates and survivors all across this country. And 18 years ago, we were discussing with a bipartisan group of members, Republicans and Democrats, men and women, who believed that it was finally time for the federal government to provide resources for shelters and services and programs and support for law enforcement and for protections for women who were experiencing domestic violence. And I am actually saddened today that here we are in the Congress with Republicans taking one track and Democrats on another track on an issue that for the time that I have had professional experience on working on this issue in state legislatures and in the Congress, that has always been worked across both sides of the aisle with great agreement about the need to protect women against violence, that in fact we stand here today with a partisan divide that I think for so many millions of women across this country who are experiencing violence is not something that we understand. Today we had an opportunity on the grounds of the Capitol to honor peace officers from around the country who had lost their lives. Some of those peace officers lost their lives because they were responding to situations of domestic violence. When the Violence Against Women Act was passed in 1994, it was passed because of several years of prior work. I remember working on the Violence Against Women Act and its various iterations as early as 1990 with Orrin Hatch, a Republican from Utah, and Senator Joseph Biden, now Vice President, a Democrat from Delaware, working on the House side with Republicans and Democrats as we sought the right kind of compromise so that we could end the scourge of domestic violence in homes all across this country. And since the passage of the Violence Against Women Act as a bipartisan piece of legislation, it really revolutionized the way that violent crimes against women are prosecuted and prevented and the way that communities respond to survivors. I can recall as long ago as when I was in second grade living on a military installation in very close quarters where you could hear through the thin walls of a family that was experiencing domestic violence. And our experience then is that the military police would respond. They would drive the service member around the block, and he would be back in the home. That was happening not just on military installations, but in communities all across the country. With the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, it was a real message to law enforcement. We're going to provide you the tools and the training and the capacity to respond appropriately to victims of domestic violence. That's what we did in 1994. It's what we reauthorized with bipartisan support in 2000 and then again in 2005. I can recall that as a resident advisor in college that I remember the horrible situation of having to call an emergency service for a young who had attempted suicide because she was in a violent relationship. In 2005 and 2000, we put resources in the Violence Against Women Act that enabled colleges and universities and communities to provide the kind of support and services that that young woman would have needed. I can recall being a co-worker of a young woman who showed up at work every day, working in a high technology field, fully educated, but she was experiencing violence. She calls me on the telephone in the middle of the night from a phone booth, naked, having been battered by her abuser, not having any place to go, and a shelter very far away. Today, because of what we've done at the federal level on violence against women, that particular survivor, that victim has recourse and has the ability to seek shelter and service that's available to her. When I testified 18 years ago before our House Judiciary Committee, I told the story of my own family, a family of 4 girls, and they say 1 in 4 women experiences violence at any time in their lifetime. Well, that was my family, my one sister, held at gunpoint, at knife point in my household. And I think that what we did in 1994, what we've done in subsequent legislation, reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act in 2000 and 2005, has gone a long way to assure that women like my sister, women like my co-workers, like the students in college, like battered immigrant women who, under threat of deportation from their abuser, under the threat of their own physical safety, afraid because they might be deported from going to seek shelter and services. Well, in 2005, when we reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, we said to those battered immigrant women, you don't have to be under threat of deportation if you're experiencing domestic violence. And yet here we are today in a Congress where the other side of the aisle, the Republicans in the Congress, are actually proposing rollbacks in the protections that we have offered to those who've experienced domestic violence, whether they are citizen survivors or they're immigrant women, or they require, cultural and linguistic services, or they're lesbians and gays and transgender people in relationships who also require services. This is not the kind of country you are, and I think certainly in 1994 and in the subsequent reauthorizations of the Violence Against Women Act in 2000 and 2005 that passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, that we did not envision that in 2012, that in 2012 we would actually be rolling back the protections that we had offered those who experience violence. And I will have more to say about this, because I think when I think back to my history of working on this issue, and so many of us have in this Congress across the aisles to provide the kinds of support and services and shelters and programs and training and law enforcement and prosecution that holds people accountable, that it is really sad that we're here on this floor of the House today rolling back the protections for those who experience violence. And with that, if you would not